There are several layers and components involved with action method execution. The controller class provided by the MVC framework puts all of this in motion during its execute method. It's at this point that the action invoker is utilized. The action invoker is responsible for selecting and executing the best method to handle the incoming request. We will look at the specifics of how the action invoker decides on a method in a later lesson. From a high level, it chooses by matching route data to a method's name, along with any action selectors that are applied to that method. Once a method has been chosen, before it's executed, the authentication and authorization process begins. These security steps are implemented through MVC filters. If you've never worked with filters before, they are components that allow you to inject extra logic into the processing pipeline. So first, the authentication filters run. The MVC framework checks to see if the person is who they say they are. If the authentication fails, a challenge is sent back to the requester. If it succeeds, we move on to authorization. Authorization is the process of figuring out what the requester is allowed to do now that we know who they are. If the requester is not authorized, a challenge is again sent back to the browser. The nature of these challenges can vary, though by default it can be as simple as redirecting the user to a login page. If the user passes both the authorization and authentication tests, the pipeline moves forward. So the action invoker has chosen a method to execute, and the framework knows they are authenticated and authorized. Before that method can execute, however, it needs to have its parameters populated. That's where model binding comes in. Model binding is the process of taking data from the request and potentially other sources and uses that information to create objects for the action method parameters. We will look more at model binding a bit later. After the parameters are populated, there is one more step before the method executes. The action invoker first runs the appropriate action filters that are attached to the method. Action filters come in two shapes: on action executing, which fire before the action method, and on action executed, which fire afterward. So at this point, the on action executing filters are run. After these classes have done their work, the action method itself finally gets called. Action methods in the MVC framework return an action result. There are various types of results that can be returned, and we have an entire module coming up devoted to result execution. The action result is what actually renders a response for a request. This can be a bit confusing when you start learning about the MVC pipeline. I think the easiest way to think about this is that the action method determines and prepares the type of response that will handle the request. This result is then handed off to the framework to actually execute and generate that response. After an action result has been produced, the onActionExecuted action filters run. This allows us to add any final logic into the pipeline before the result is executed and a response is generated. In some cases, the authentication and authorization challenge will actually fire again at this point. This can happen in scenarios where additional security checks are needed before a response is sent back to the browser. As you may have guessed by now, all of these steps are open to extensibility. That's one of the many things that makes the MVC framework so great. In the next few lessons, we'll dissect these steps in more depth, starting with the action invoker.